Echoes of the Wooden Blade, Chapter 1. The Salt and the Silence. The rain in Mallow Bay wasn't a gentle weeping. It was a vengeful lash, a constant, insistent reminder of the sea's indifference. It hammered against the weathered planks of the docks, slicking the gray stone with a film of brine and a mournful, rhythmic drumming. The air, thick with the scent of rotting seaweed and impending death, tasted of salt and regret. Ren stood motionless, a silhouette etched against the bruised purple of the sky, observing. He wasn't a figure of presence, more a phantom sculpted by the storm. He was a man ravaged by loss, a husk worn smooth by the ceaseless grind of sorrow. His clothes, once the dark indigo of a loyal guard's tunic, were now patched and stained, clinging to a frame that had, at one time, been built for swift, brutal efficiency. His hair, the color of wet charcoal, was long and unkempt, plastered to his forehead by the rain. Most noticeably, however, was the absence of sound. Ren didn't speak. He hadn't spoken in 5 years. Not since the night the order came, the night the blood spilled, and the silence consumed him. He held a single object, a bokken, a wooden practice sword, worn smooth with age and handled with a reverence bordering on worship. It wasn't a weapon, not anymore. It was a weight, a memory, a tangible connection to a past he couldn't, and wouldn't, reclaim. The wood was dark, almost black in the gloom, polished to a sheen by countless hours of touch. Its surface etched with faint ghost marks from past training. Had been drawn to Mallow Bay by a feeling, not a voice. A current of suffering, a pulse of desperate hope that resonated with the mournful strains of his bamboo flute. The flute, a simple instrument carved with intricate waves, lay nestled within his sash, its presence a small defiant spark in the overwhelming gloom. He played it infrequently, the melodies often rising and falling like the tide itself, brief, poignant, and heartbreakingly beautiful. The docks were a scene of subdued desperation. Fishermen, faces etched with exhaustion and haunted by fear, huddled beneath the meager shelter of fishing nets, mending broken lines and shooing away scavenging gulls. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if conserving energy, as if afraid to attract attention. The pirates who controlled the bay were a constant, looming threat, visible in the shadows of the towering fortress, rising from the cliffs above a jagged wound in the coastline, built from stolen timber and the lives of the enslaved. Ren had been observing them for 3 days, had watched them brutalize the villagers, witnessed the systematic stripping of the bay's resources, and noted the growing despair in their eyes. He hadn't intervened. He hadn't drawn a single blade. He was, he told himself, a silent observer, a shadow haunting the periphery of this tragedy. Then he saw it. Near the edge of the docks, old man Haru, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and sorrow, was attempting to haul a heavy net, his movements slow and labored. Red-Eye Garrow, the pirate captain, a hulking brute, adorned with rusting armor and a vicious scar, bisecting his face, stood overseeing the operation, accompanied by a dozen heavily armed men. Haru had been a fisherman his entire life, his hands calloused and strong from years of wrestling with the sea. But the relentless demands of Garrow's operation were breaking him. Suddenly, one of the pirates, a young man named Kale, raised his cutlass. He moved with a predatory grace, aiming a swift, brutal blow at Haru's back. Before anyone could react, before even Haru could brace himself, Ren moved. It wasn't a deliberate movement, it was instinctive, a honed reflex born of years spent anticipating the next attack. He lunged, a blur of motion against the gray backdrop, his wooden sword a dark extension of his arm. The sound was shockingly sharp, the splintering of steel against steel. Kale's cutlass shattered, fragments scattering across the wet planks. The pirates recoiled, momentarily stunned. Ren's movements were fluid, unsettling, almost like the ebb and flow of the tide itself. He knocked two of the attackers back into the icy water with a precisely placed blow to the shoulder. The young fisherman, Haru, looked at Ren with a mixture of fear and gratitude, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then, his daughter, a girl no older than 13 named Hana, screamed, "Mercy! Please, have mercy." A pirate, a man with a cruel, sneering smile, raised his own cutlass. He advanced on Hana, his movements deliberate and menacing. Ren stepped in front of her, a silent barrier between her and the impending violence. The air thickened with the metallic scent of blood, the sound of crashing waves, and the haunting melody of Ren's flute, a single, sorrowful note piercing the storm. It was a note of defiance, a lament for what was lost, and a promise of what might yet be. Echoes of the Wooden Blade. Chapter 2. Tide and shadow the rain. A persistent, clinging drizzle mirrored the despair settling over Mallow Bay. The scent of salt, once a comforting tang, was now laced with the acrid tang of burnt wood and fear. The remnants of the battle lay scattered across the docks, shattered planks, clumps of seaweed slick with blood, and the blackened bones of the pirates' makeshift rafts. Hana, shivering and wrapped in her mother's worn kimono, huddled close to Haru, her wide eyes reflecting the flickering orange glow of a makeshift torch. Ren, a solitary silhouette against the bruised twilight, remained motionless amidst the chaos, his bokken held loosely in his hand. The flute, clutched between his fingers, emitted a low, mournful drone, not a triumphant fanfare, but a sorrowful echo of the battle, a lament for the lives already claimed. It wasn't a sound of aggression, but of profound understanding. The remaining pirates, a ragged band of hardened men, regrouped, their faces etched with a mixture of fury and bewildered respect. Red-Eye Garrow, a hulking figure with a scarred face and a missing eye, surveyed the scene from the ravaged deck of his flagship, the Serpent's Kiss. He spat on the water, a guttural sound of impotent rage. The Silent One! He saved the girl, he bellowed, his voice a gravelly rasp. Hell pay for this. Garrow's men, fueled by wine and a burning desire for retribution, began to systematically search the docks, their cutlasses flashing in the gloom. They were looking for Ren, a phantom they couldn't quite grasp, a shadow that had disrupted their plans with unnerving efficiency. Haru, spurred by a newfound resolve, began to organize the survivors. He directed the clearing of debris, his movements surprisingly purposeful. He understood instinctively that the immediate threat wasn't just the pirates, but the looming presence of despair. "We rebuild," he shouted, his voice hoarse but firm. "We show them this bay will not break." Ren observed this with quiet intensity, his gaze sweeping across the scene, the injured, the exhausted, the terrified. He felt a kinship with them, a deep understanding of their suffering. It wasn't pity he felt, but recognition of a shared burden, a shared refusal to yield to darkness. He moved with a deliberate grace, a ripple in the damp air, helping to haul a fallen fishing skiff back onto the docks, his movements subtly guiding a younger boy, no older than 8, to secure a loose timber. As the rain began to fall harder, a strange calmness settled over Ren. He noticed the gathering of the older fishermen, their faces grim, huddled around a makeshift fire. They were discussing the tide, its ebb and flow, its treacherous currents. He understood their concern. The pirates' blockade had changed the bay, disrupted the natural rhythms that sustained their lives. Approaching the group, Ren raised his bokken slightly, not as a threat, but as a gesture of acknowledgement. He then began to play his flute, not a full melody, but a series of short, precise tones, mimicking the sounds of the waves. He explained, through a combination of gestures and the haunting music, the principle of harnessing the tide's movements, of predicting the shifts in the currents, of using the bay's natural defenses to their advantage. His words, unspoken, were remarkably clear. He spoke of the kawasengi, the ebb and flow, a fundamental understanding of the sea passed down through generations of fishermen, now refined into a deadly, strategic application. He revealed how, using carefully placed rocks and woven kelp, they could create currents that would push the pirates' ships towards the jagged reefs that ring the bay. The fishermen, initially skeptical, were quickly won over by the precision and the undeniable logic of his approach. They began to experiment, their movements becoming more coordinated, their understanding of the bay deepening. As they worked, Garrow and his men, still searching for Ren, spotted them. They saw the flickering lights, heard the rhythmic splashing of the fishermen manipulating the water, and, most significantly, noticed the haunting melody of the flute. "There he is!" Garrow roared, pointing a thick finger. "The Silent One is teaching them to fight." He ordered his men to surround the group, their cutlasses raised. But before they could advance, Ren moved, a blur of motion that seemed to defy the laws of physics. He didn't draw his bokken. Instead, he used the wooden practice sword to deflect a blow aimed at a young boy, sending the pirate's cutlass spinning harmlessly into the rain. His movements were economical, brutal, and utterly effective. The pirates, taken aback by this sudden lethal display, hesitated. Ren's silent dominance was unnerving. He was a force of nature, a phantom born of the sea, and he was letting them know that Mallow Bay would not surrender without a fight. The mournful notes of his flute grew louder, a chilling warning carried on the wind, echoing the shadows of the wooden blade. Chapter 3. The tide's ire the rain intensified, a relentless curtain of gray that plastered the faces of the pirates and the fishermen alike. The air hung thick with the smell of salt, wet wood, and the acrid tang of fear. Garrow, a mountain of a man with a face scarred like a ravaged coastline, stood at the head of his circle, his breath a ragged gust of fury. His eyes, the color of a bruised storm, fixed on Ren with a simmering hatred. "You are a ghost, Ronin," Garrow spat, the words echoing off the slick stone docks. "A shadow clinging to the edges of this world. You think you can control the ocean? The ocean controls men!" Ren remained motionless, a statue carved from the dampness. He continued to play, a slow, deliberate lament on his bamboo flute. A phrase, not a tune, a sequence of notes that spoke of loss and defiance, of a broken oath and an unyielding spirit. The sound resonated with the surging tide, a subtle warning that vibrated in the bone. Several of Garrow's men shifted uneasily, the hypnotic quality of the flute disrupting their aggression. Ren wasn't offering combat, not directly. He was offering something far more potent, a sense of inescapable consequence. "Silence!" Garrow bellowed, his voice cracking with frustration. He signaled to a hulking brute, a man named Boruk, who was infamous for his brutality. "Take him. Alive. Let's see if this silent warrior can withstand a proper fight." Boruk advanced, his heavy cutlass dripping with rain. He moved with a clumsy, predictable power, relying on brute force rather than finesse. Ren anticipated his every move, not with immediate reaction, but with a careful, almost unsettling stillness. He didn't draw his bokken. Instead, he pivoted, using the limited space of the dock to become a living obstacle, forcing Boruk to expend unnecessary energy, his movements mirroring the ebb and flow of the rising tide. The first blow Boruk landed was a glancing strike, deflected by the bokken with a dull thud. The impact sent a spray of water from the blade, and a low, mournful note escaped Ren's flute. It wasn't a sound of aggression, but of observation. Assessing the pirate's weight, his stance, the angle of his attack. Boruk, enraged, pressed his assault, swinging his cutlass in a wide arc. Ren, with the grace of a falling stone, sidestepped the blow, the bokken flashing momentarily as he used it to snag Boruk's wrist, pulling the pirate off balance. Boruk stumbled, his feet scrambling for purchase on the slick stones. He roared in frustration, attempting to regain his footing. But Ren was already moving, a ripple in the rain, disorienting and relentless. Suddenly, a young fisherman, a boy named Kenji, cried out, "Sensei! Be careful!" He hurled a handful of wet clay at Boruk, disrupting his aim and momentarily stunning the pirate. Ren seized the opportunity. He didn't attack directly. He used the bokken to subtly alter the trajectory of Boruk's next swing, guiding the blade harmlessly into the churning water. The clang of metal on water was swallowed by the rain, but the effect was unmistakable. Boruk, bewildered and frustrated, swung wildly, missing Ren entirely. The pirates, witnessing this unsettling display, began to falter. They recognized that Ren wasn't simply a passive threat. He was a force, a conduit for the bay's power, a whirlwind of calculated precision. Their confidence eroded, replaced by a growing unease. "Hes not fighting," one of the men shouted, his voice laced with confusion. "Hes manipulating the water." And as he spoke, the tide itself responded. A sudden surge of water, a miniature wave, rushed towards Boruk, forcing him to retreat, his cutlass splashing into the dark water. The fishermen, sensing the change, began to work with renewed urgency, directing the flow of the tide with their feet, manipulating the currents in a way that seemed almost intentional. Garrow's face twisted in a mask of fury. He recognized the pattern, the coordinated effort, the subtle influence over the sea. "Hes using the bay against us," he roared. "That silent fool. Hes turned our own strength against us." He charged forward, attempting to reach Ren. But the fishermen, now fully aware of Ren's strategy, formed a semicircle around him, a wall of weathered faces and determined eyes. The rhythmic chanting of the fishermen, punctuated by Ren's mournful flute, created a disorienting wave of sound, adding to the pirates' confusion. Just as Garrow lunged, Ren used a final, exquisitely timed movement, leveraging the momentum of the rising tide, to shove the pirate off balance. Garrow stumbled, sprawling onto the dock, his axe falling from his grasp. Before he could recover, a wave of seawater surged over him, carrying him off the docks and towards the waiting embrace of the bay. Silence descended once more, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain and the haunting melody of the flute. Ren stood amidst the chaos, the bokken held loosely in his hand, his eyes reflecting the turbulent gray of the water. The tide, now a powerful ally, continued to rise. A dark promise whispered on the wind the tide's ire. Chapter 4. The serpent's embrace the rain intensified. A curtain of cold, insistent needles drumming against the decaying timber of the docks. The air, thick with salt water and the acrid scent of burning oil, clung to Ren's lungs, a constant reminder of the battle's brutal ballet. Garrow was gone, swallowed by the bay's hungry maw, but the victory felt strangely incomplete, a hollow echo in the heart of the ravaged cove. The fishermen, a tangle of soaked and exhausted figures, continued their work, tirelessly weaving the kelp nets, their movements now imbued with a practiced, almost hypnotic rhythm. They weren't cheering, weren't offering praise. Instead, they worked in a solemn reverence, as if addressing a deity they understood intimately, the sea itself. Ren watched them, his face a study in impassive melancholy. The wooden bokken a simple extension of his arm, a silent sentinel against the lingering threat. The rhythmic pulse of his flute began again, a low, keening lament not of victory, but of loss, of shattered oaths, of the weight of unspoken sorrow. The melody spiraled outwards, carried on the wind, a fragile thread connecting him to the suffering head, witnessed, and, in a brief, violent flash, mitigated. A grizzled fisherman named Kaito, his face etched with years of hardship and the salt spray, approached Ren, offering him a cup of lukewarm tea brewed from foraged herbs. He didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes. He simply placed the cup before him, a gesture of quiet respect. Ren took a sip, the bitter liquid momentarily warming his throat, a small comfort in the overwhelming dampness. "The tide it answers him," Kaito said, his voice a raspy murmur, his words barely audible above the rain. "It remembers the old ways, the balance. Your music. It guides it." Ren offered no response, simply nodded, the movement barely perceptible. He knew Kaito wasn't questioning his methods, he wasn't capable of it. He was simply observing, documenting the strange, profound connection that had formed between the man, the sea, and the silent Ronin. Suddenly, a frantic shout cut through the rain's relentless drone. Young Hana, Garrow's daughter, a fiery spirit trapped in a small, ravaged body, rushed towards Ren, her face streaked with mud and tears. She clutched a small, tarnished locket, its edges worn smooth by anxious fingers. "Please," she choked out, her voice thick with desperation. He says his father is alive, has held captive in the fortress. He wants to kill you, he says. He says you stole his glory." Ren's hand tightened around the bokken. Garrow's rage, born of defeat, hadn't vanished with the pirate captain himself. It had merely been redirected, aimed now at the source, the silent Ronin who had disrupted his carefully constructed dominion. "The fortress is built on shifting sands," Ren finally said, his voice a dry whisper, the words perfectly formed, yet utterly devoid of inflection. The flute momentarily ceased its lament, replaced by a sharper, more urgent note, a warning carried on the wind. He began to move, not with the fluid grace of the initial skirmish, but with a deliberate, unsettling purpose. He wasn't leading them, not in the traditional sense. Instead, he was directing, influencing, subtly manipulating the flow of the tide, creating miniature whirlpools, guiding the current to converge on specific points. It was as if he were conducting a vast, unseen orchestra, each wave a note, each ripple a chord. As he worked, a dozen figures emerged from the shadows of the fortress Garrows, remaining loyalists, hardened pirates, armed with cutlasses and pistols. They weren't prepared for a direct assault. They hadn't anticipated a silent enemy, a master strategist manipulating the very elements against them. The first wave of attackers charged, emboldened by their captain's rage. But the bay answered Ren's silent command. The tide surged, not with the force of a sudden storm, but with a slow, inexorable pressure, forcing the pirates back, create treacherous pools of swirling water that tripped and hampered their advance. Ren's bokken moved with a terrifying precision, a blur of wood against steel. He didn't seek to kill. He aimed to disarm, to disrupt, to demoralize. Each perfectly executed block, each deftly placed strike, was a brutal demonstration of the bay's newfound allegiance. As he fought, he noticed a subtle shift in the water, a tightening around the fortress walls. The tide wasn't just resisting the pirates, it was actively constricting them, choking off their movement, building to a crescendo. The fishermen, sensing the imminent shift, intensified their efforts, their chanting growing louder, their movements more synchronized. The serpent's embrace was tightening. Then, a single piercing gunshot shattered the rain's relentless drumming. A pirate, perched atop a makeshift barricade, had found an opening and was aiming directly at Ren. Before Ren could react, a net, woven with the sharpest kelp, descended from above, ensnaring the pirate in its merciless grip. He thrashed wildly, his struggles futile against the inexorable force of the bay. Silence again, deeper this time, pregnant with anticipation. Ren raised his flute to his lips and began to play. The melody wasn't a lament this time. It was a declaration, a song of defiance, a promise of retribution, a chilling echo of the wooden blade's silent vengeance. The tide responded, rising with a final devastating surge. A dark, swirling vortex promising to claim what was lost. Chapter 5. The serpents coiled the rain, continued its relentless assault, a gray, viscous curtain that clung to the rough-hewn timbers of the docks and plastered Ren's dark hair to his forehead. The air, thick with salt and the acrid tang of burning oil, hung heavy with the residue of the night's chaos. The flames of the Black Serpent, Garrow's flagship, still pulsed weakly, licking at the cliff face like a dying beast, casting grotesque shadows that danced with the swirling mist. The villagers, exhausted but exhilarated, worked with a grim efficiency, hauling salvaged planks and reinforcing the makeshift barricades erected around the harbor. Their faces, etched with the hardships of months under Garrow's tyranny, were now alight with a fragile, defiant hope. The rhythmic chanting, a low, guttural drone woven with the cries of gulls and the splash of the receding tide, had become the heartbeat of Mallow Bay. Ren, a solitary figure amidst the activity, remained on the pier, his bokken held loosely at his side, the wood worn smooth by the rain and the countless, silent practices. He observed the villagers, not with judgment, but with a quiet understanding. He didn't offer words, didn't direct, simply was. His presence, a silent sentinel, seemed to channel the very essence of the bay's response, a dark, unsettling calm before the next surge. A young boy, no older than 10, approached him cautiously, offering a handful of dried seaweed. Ren accepted it with a slight inclination of his head, his fingers brushing against the boy's small hand in a gesture of acknowledgement. He raised his flute, not to play a song, but to gently examine the seaweed, the movement slow and deliberate. The boy watched, fascinated, a spark of understanding flickering in his eyes. Suddenly, the chanting abruptly ceased. A collective gasp rippled through the villagers. Their eyes, scanning the turbulent waters, locked onto a sight that stole the breath from their lungs. The tide, which had been grudgingly retreating, was reversing with terrifying speed. Not a gentle flow, but a brutal, consuming surge, a serpentine coil tightening its grip around the fortress. The shallows, previously exposed, were rapidly filling with dark, churning water. The carefully constructed barricades, once formidable defenses, began to buckle and splinter under the relentless assault. "The serpent's awake?" An old fisherman, his face weathered like driftwood, shouted, his voice barely audible above the roar of the water. "Ren-san, what have you done?" Ren didn't respond. He simply continued to watch, his face an impassive mask. It was not his doing. He hadn't consciously summoned this power. He had simply facilitated it. The villagers, in their desperate struggle for survival, had unknowingly awakened something ancient and primal, a deep-rooted connection between the bay and its inhabitants. The bay wasn't merely resisting the pirates, it was actively dismantling their domain. A figure emerged from the mist, Captain Silas, one of Garrow's most brutal lieutenants. He was a mountain of muscle and scarred skin, wielding a wickedly curved cutlass and a pistol. He moved, with a predatory grace, surveying the chaos with a cold, calculating gaze. "The Ronin," he spat, his voice thick with contempt, "is manipulating the tide, turning our own defenses against us. We must silence him." Silas and a squad of pirates charged towards Ren, their cutlasses raised. They moved with a reckless abandon, fueled by panic and a lust for blood. Ren met them with a fluid, almost impossible grace. His bokken wasn't a weapon of brute force, it was an extension of his will, a conduit for the bay's fury. He danced between the pirates' attacks, deflecting their blows with precise blocks, redirecting their momentum with expertly placed strikes. Each movement was a testament to a lifetime of discipline, a silent, brutal choreography. A pirate swung wildly. Aiming a blow at Ren's head, he sidestepped, the pirate's blade whistling past his ear, and with a swift, controlled motion, disarmed him, sending the cutlass clattering across the docks. Another attacked with a savage roar, but Ren simply flowed around him, like water, leaving him vulnerable and disoriented. As Ren neutralized the immediate threat, he noticed a subtle shift in the water, a tightening around the fortress walls. The tide wasn't just resisting the pirates, it was actively constricting them, choking off their movement, building to a crescendo. The fishermen, sensing the imminent shift, intensified their efforts, their chanting growing louder, their movements more synchronized. The serpent's embrace was tightening. Then, a single, piercing gunshot shattered the rain's relentless drumming. A pirate, perched atop a makeshift barricade, had found an opening and was aiming directly at Ren. Before Ren could react, a net, woven with the sharpest kelp, descended from above, ensnaring the pirate in its merciless grip. He thrashed wildly, his struggles futile against the inexorable force of the bay. Silence again, deeper this time, pregnant with anticipation. Ren raised his flute to his lips and began to play. The melody wasn't a lament this time. It was a declaration, a song of defiance, a promise of retribution, a chilling echo of the wooden blade's silent vengeance. The tide responded, rising with a final, devastating surge, a dark, swirling vortex promising to claim what was lost. Echoes of the Wooden Blade, Chapter 6. The serpents kissed the rain. A cold, insistent shroud continued its relentless drumming upon the weathered planks of Mallow Bay's docks. It wasn't merely water, it was the weeping of a drowned land, a lament for the stolen harvest and the broken spirit of a people. The air, thick with the stench of salt, wood smoke, and fear, clung to Ren's lungs, a constant reminder of the brutality he had encountered. He stood motionless, a silhouette carved from the gray dusk, the polished wood of his bokken gleaming faintly in the fractured light. The fishermen, a ragged cohort of 20, worked with a grim, focused intensity, their movements honed by weeks of desperation and driven by the haunting rhythm of his flute. The kelp nets, shimmering with embedded obsidian shards, were being meticulously deployed, weaving a deadly tapestry across the water. The pirates, demoralized but still dangerous, continued their sporadic attacks, clumsy, panicked rushes against the barricades of sharpened timber and the shifting currents. Garrow, a mountain of scarred muscle and simmering rage, had grown increasingly erratic, fueled by whiskey and the creeping realization that his carefully constructed blockade was unraveling. It was during one of these brief lulls, a momentary pocket of unsettling calm, that Ren noticed the subtle shift. Not a change in the weather. The rain remained a constant, cold embrace, but a deepening within the water itself. The tide, which had been stubbornly resisting the pirates' attempts to breach the harbor, began to pull inwards, not with the predictable ebb and flow, but with a deliberate, almost sentient constriction. He didn't speak, of course. Words were a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he raised his flute to his lips, and the sound that emerged wasn't a lament, but a low, resonant hum, a tonal shift, a precise manipulation of the air that subtly commanded the fishermen's movements. They instinctively adjusted their positions, their actions mirroring the rising pressure of the bay, amplifying the tide's influence. The serpent's embrace is tightening. Old Man Ito, the most weathered of the fishermen, rasped, his voice hoarse from shouting orders in the perpetual damp. His eyes, milky with age, held an unnerving intensity, a quiet understanding of forces beyond mortal comprehension. The tightening was more than just the tide. It felt orchestrated, as if the very water itself was responding to Ren's silent command, a dark, fluid intelligence coalescing around the fortress walls. The fishermen, understanding instinctively, increased their chanting, a guttural drone of ancestral spirits invoked to lend their strength to the bay's defense. Then, a single, piercing gunshot shattered the rain's relentless drumming. A pirate, perched atop a makeshift barricade constructed from salvaged ship masts, had found an opening, a vulnerability in the fisherman's vigilance. He was a wiry figure, barely more than a boy, but his hand gripped a black powder pistol with deadly precision. He fired not at Ren, but at the nets, a desperate attempt to disrupt their deployment. Before Ren could react, a net, woven with the sharpest kelp, descended from above, a shimmering, deadly cascade. It wasn't a random drop. The fisherman, guided by Ren's silent instructions, had calculated the trajectory, accounting for the wind, the water's current, and the pirate's erratic movements. The net descended with impossible speed, ensnaring the pirate in its merciless grip. He thrashed wildly, a tangle of limbs and frustrated fury, his struggles futile against the inexorable force of the bay. The kelp, coated in a viscous resin harvested from local mangrove trees, tightened with horrifying efficiency, crushing bone and shredding flesh. Silence descended again, deeper this time, pregnant with anticipation. The rain continued to fall, but its impact lessened, as if the bay itself was holding its breath. Ren raised his flute to his lips and began to play. The melody wasn't a lament this time. It was a declaration, a song of defiance, a promise of retribution, a chilling echo of the wooden blade's silent vengeance. The notes weren't soaring or triumphant, they were sharp, precise, almost surgical, a focused channeling of energy. The tide responded. It rose with a final, devastating surge, a dark, swirling vortex of water and kelp, driven by a power that seemed to originate not just from the moon's pull, but from something older, something primal. The vortex didn't simply engulf the pirate's flagship, the Crimson Maw, it consumed it. The ship, a monstrous galleon bristling with cannons and manned by 100 bloodthirsty souls, was dragged beneath the waves, disappearing without a trace. Garrow, witnessing the devastation from the deck of his own vessel, the Black Talon, roared in a frenzy of rage. He rallied his remaining men, ordering a full assault, a desperate, futile charge against the rising tide. But it was too late. The fisherman, empowered by Ren's silent guidance and the bay's cooperative fury, were waiting. Ren moved through the chaos with impossible grace, a phantom in the rain and the swirling water. He didn't engage in direct combat. Instead, he exploited the chaos, using his unparalleled awareness to anticipate the pirates' movements, disrupting their formations, drawing them into the path of the rising tide. The wooden blade remained sheathed, a silent, deadly extension of the bay itself. As the Black Talon floundered in the churning water, the vortex intensified, pulling debris, wreckage, and a final handful of terrified pirates into its maw. The last scream was swallowed by the roar of the waves. The morning sun, a pale disk struggling through the dissipating clouds, rose over a free, sparkling ocean. The villagers emerging from their shelters gathered on the docks to celebrate, their faces etched with relief and disbelief. But Ren was already walking the coastline, the salt spray clinging to his worn robes, the haunting melody of his flute casting a bittersweet shadow over the waves. He drifted toward the next horizon, a silent, solitary figure carrying the echoes of the wooden blade, a testament to honor forged in blood and delivered in silence. Chapter 7. The serpent's breath. The salt air hung thick and heavy, carrying the scent of burnt wood and brine. Mallow Bay, though scarred, pulsed with a tentative hope, a fragile blossom pushing through the blackened earth. The villagers, initially wary of the silent Ronin, now offered him small gifts, a freshly caught fish, a woven mat, a bowl of rice wine, tokens of gratitude, delivered with averted eyes and murmured thanks. Ren accepted them with a slight inclination of his head, and a single mournful note from his bamboo flute, a sound that seemed to absorb the weight of their gratitude and the lingering sorrow. He spent the day observing, a shadow amongst the rebuilding. He noticed the meticulous work of young Kenji, a boy barely 15, painstakingly repairing a collapsed section of the harbor wall, his brow furrowed with grim determination. He saw the weathered hands of Hana, the old fisherman's wife, patiently teaching her grandchildren how to mend nets, her movements a lifetime etched in each gesture. It was in their quiet resilience that Ren found a measure of solace, a fragile counterpoint to the ceaseless, aching void within him. As twilight bled across the bruised sky, casting long, skeletal shadows from the newly erected fortifications, Garrow, arrived, not in a triumphant, conquering manner, but with a sullen, simmering rage. He was flanked by a dozen of his most brutal lieutenants, their faces smeared with grime and the residue of violence. The air itself seemed to thicken with his malevolence, a palpable serpent's breath. So, the little ghost has decided to grace us with his presence. Garrow's voice was a rasp, a gravelly delivery punctuated by the metallic tang of blood. He surveyed the scene, his single, perpetually narrowed eye fixated on Ren. "You disrupted my plans, Ronin. You stole our victory. You will pay." He gestured to his men, and a wave of steel surged forward, a predatory advance. This time, Ren didn't attempt to evade. He didn't vanish into the shadows. He stood his ground, a lone figure of stoic defiance against the impending onslaught. The fisherman, alerted by the approaching threat, moved to form a protective ring around the villagers, their faces hardened with a newfound courage. But Ren didn't draw his bokken. Instead, he raised his flute to his lips. The sound that emerged wasn't mournful. Not this time. It was sharp, piercing, a frantic cascade of notes that seemed to unravel the pirate's movements. He was channeling the rhythm of the bay, the surge and ebb of the tide, translating it into a sonic weapon. The effect was unsettling. The pirates, accustomed to the brutal efficiency of hand-to-hand combat, found themselves disoriented, their attacks faltering, their coordination disrupted. Garrow, a veteran of countless raids, recognized the disruption immediately. Heck, he roared, lunging forward with his cutlass. This time Ren reacted, not with a deliberate strike, but with a fluid, almost instinctive movement. He sidestepped Garrow's clumsy attack, using the momentum to send the pirates sprawling into a pile of recently dumped timber. The pirates, thrown into chaos by the unsettling flute music and Ren's uncanny movement, lost their advantage. The battle was not one of grand displays of prowess, but of precise, debilitating interventions. Ren used the terrain, the narrow alleyways, the crumbling foundations of the fort to his advantage, exploiting gaps and shadows, disrupting formations, leading the pirates into carefully orchestrated traps. He didn't kill, not directly. He disarmed, incapacitated, forced them to stumble into the churning water. One particularly large pirate, a hulking brute named Kale, managed to land a glancing blow with his axe against Ren's arm. Blood bloomed on the fabric of his robe, a dark stain against the gray. But Ren didn't flinch. He simply continued his dance of evasion and disruption, the bamboo flute a whirling vortex of sound. As the battle raged, Kenji, remembering Ren's earlier instructions, expertly utilized a series of strategically placed fishing hooks attached to strong ropes, snagging the pirates' feet and sending them tumbling into the harbor. Hana, with surprising agility, hurled handfuls of stinging seaweed at the attackers, blinding them momentarily. Finally, exhausted and demoralized, Garrow, realizing he was losing, let out a guttural howl of frustration. He raised his hand, signaling a retreat. Retreat. This land is cursed. As the last of the pirates scrambled back to their war-galleys, a chilling silence descended upon Mallow Bay. The villagers cheered, a ragged, joyous cry that echoed across the water. Ren lowered his flute, the final notes fading into the stillness. He knelt beside Kenji, carefully applying a poultice made of sea herbs to his injured arm. Looking out at the retreating fleet, now a dark smudge against the darkening horizon, Ren knew this was not an end, but a pause. He looked at Garrow, now struggling to maintain control of his remaining men, and offered a single mournful note on his flute. It wasn't a threat, not a call to battle. It was a simple acknowledgement, a ghost acknowledging a serpent. And as he drifted away, the echoes of the wooden blade whispered on the wind, waiting for the next chapter of his silent defiance. Chapter 8. The Salt-Kissed Requiem. The dawn of Mallow Bay was a bruised purple bleeding into a sickly gray. The smell of burnt timber and brine clung to everything, a visceral reminder of the night's fury. The cheers of the villagers had quieted, replaced by a weary reverence. They gathered around Ren, not with triumphant cries, but with a hesitant gratitude, their faces etched with the stark reality of violence. Kenji, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage of woven kelp and sea moss, offered Ren a portion of the meager catch, a single struggling cod, a token of their newfound respect. Ren accepted it with a slight bow, his silence a profound statement. He didn't need thanks, he seemed to communicate, just acknowledgement. He took a single, deliberate bite of the fish, chewing slowly, his eyes fixed on the turbulent gray water. The rhythmic scrape of his wooden bokken against the worn planks of the dock was a counterpoint to the lapping waves, a solemn percussion to the scene. Hana, her face smeared with stinging seaweed and exhaustion, approached cautiously. "You saved us, Ren-san," she said, her voice hoarse. "You turned the sea against him." Ren's fingers tightened around the bokken. He raised his flute, not to play, but to meticulously clean the bamboo with a small piece of oiled linen. The movement was precise, deliberate, a ritualistic act of preservation. He didn't meet her gaze. A shadow fell across the dock. It was Commander Ito, a grizzled veteran of the old naval guard, the man who had initially dismissed Ren's story as the ramblings of a madman. Ito was a mountain of a man, his face scarred and weathered, his eyes holding a shrewd, assessing intelligence. He carried a simple, but impeccably maintained, katana at his hip. "The rumors," Ito said, his voice gravelly, "they were true. A ghost of the past, returned to haunt the present." He regarded Ren with a measured expression. "You led them, Ren. When? You conceived this unorthodox strategy. We owe you a debt." Ren lowered his flute. "A debt is a burden," he said, his voice a low rasp, almost lost to the wind. He gestured to the destroyed galleys, now fragmented wrecks bobbing in the shallows. "The sea provides. The sea demands balance." Ito nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Garrow was a fool. He underestimated the power of the tides, and it seems, the resolve of a man who carries nothing but a wooden blade. He paused, his gaze returning to the sea. "There are whispers of other settlements along this coast, villages under similar oppression, villages that might benefit from your skills." The thought of spreading the seeds of resistance, of offering sanctuary to the vulnerable, resonated with Ren. But he remained impassive, a solitary figure in the dawnlight, a silent promise of retribution. As Ito began to speak of potential alliances, a figure emerged from the crowd. It was young Kai, the fisherman's son who had begged for mercy that fateful night, the boy who had witnessed Garrow's cruelty. He carried a crudely fashioned spear, its tip sharpened to a razor's edge. His eyes, previously filled with fear, now burned with a quiet determination. "Ren-san," Kai said, his voice surprisingly firm, "I want to learn. I want to understand how you see the world. I want to learn how to defend myself, how to protect what is right." Ren looked at Kai, a flicker of something akin to pity in his eyes. He gestured to the water with the bokken, demonstrating a simple stance, a subtle shift of weight. "The blade is a tool," he said, his words carefully chosen, not an answer. "True strength lies in understanding the rhythm of the world, in anticipating the storm." He then extended the bokken to Kai, offering it not as a weapon to be wielded, but as a teacher's tool. Kai hesitantly took the bokken, his fingers tracing the smooth, polished wood. Suddenly, a blood-curdling shriek cut through the quiet. A small group of pirates, remnants of Garrow's shattered fleet, had infiltrated the docks, intent on looting the meager supplies and terrorizing the villagers. They were a ragged, desperate band, fueled by vengeance and the intoxicating scent of chaos. Ren didn't flinch. He moved with an instinctive grace, a fluid dance of evasion and disruption. The bamboo flute, a swirling vortex of sound, distracted the pirates while Kai, emboldened by Ren's presence, launched a volley of stones at their heads. Ito, drawing his katana with a swift, deadly motion, engaged the attackers in close-quarters combat, his movements honed by years of discipline. The fight was brutal, desperate, and brief. The pirates, caught off guard and overwhelmed by the unexpected resistance, were quickly subdued. As the last of them lay bleeding on the dock, Ren knelt beside Kai, showing him how to properly secure a wound, using his knowledge of the local flora. The salt-kissed requiem of that morning lingered in the air, the cries of the wounded, the rhythmic clang of metal, the mournful song of the bamboo flute. Ren, standing amidst the wreckage and the blood, was a solitary figure, a testament to the enduring power of honor, a silent guardian against the encroaching darkness. The echoes of the wooden blade whispered on the wind, a promise of defiance, waiting for the next tide to rise. Chapter 9. Salt and Silence. The air of Mallow Bay tasted of iron and brine, heavy with the ghosts of the morning's violence. The sun, a bruised plum struggling through the perpetual coastal haze, cast long, distorted shadows across the ravaged docks. The bodies of the pirates lay scattered like broken driftwood, a gruesome offering to the sea. Kai, his face streaked with grime and a newly acquired crimson line, bisecting his forearm, meticulously bandaged the wound with a strip torn from his tunic, guided by Ren's unwavering hand. Ito, a wiry man built like a coiled spring, sharpened his katana with a slow, deliberate rhythm, his eyes fixed on the turbulent gray of the bay. Ren remained motionless, a dark silhouette against the skeletal remains of a dismantled fishing skiff. He wasn't engaged in the healing, not directly. His presence was a force, a silent weight that held the scattered remnants of the villagers together. The flute lay nestled in his lap, the polished wood absorbing the dampness of the air, its smooth surface reflecting the grim reality of their situation, a temporary reprieve, bought with blood and desperation. They came from the north, past the Widow's Reef, Ito said, his voice rough, each syllable a careful articulation against the rising wind. Too many, driven by Garrow's whispers, fueled by the fear he sows. Kai nodded grimly, tightening the bandage around Kai's arm. Hell send more. He enjoys the chaos. Ren didn't respond for Bali. He simply raised the bamboo flute to his lips. A mournful, spiraling melody filled the air, a lament for the fallen, a warning to the wary. It wasn't a call to action, but a statement of intent, a declaration of unwavering resolve carved from silence and sorrow. The villagers, initially paralyzed by fear, began to move, cautiously at first, then with growing purpose. The women, their faces hardened by loss and necessity, began to salvage what remained of the salvaged store's dried fish, salted vegetables, a meager supply of rice. Children, their eyes wide with a nascent understanding of the world's cruelty, helped to gather the scattered debris, carefully avoiding the pools of blood that stained the planks. Ren observed them, his gaze assessing, calculating. He wasn't a commander, a strategist, or a warrior in the traditional sense. He was something older, something woven from the fabric of the sea itself, a reckoning. Suddenly, a flicker of movement at the edge of the docks caught his eye. A lone pirate, a younger man, his face slick with sweat and smeared with grime, was attempting to salvage a chest of preserved fruit. He was clearly inexperienced, clumsy, and profoundly unnerved by the palpable stillness surrounding him. Ren rose, his movements fluid and unnervingly silent. He didn't draw his bokken, didn't even glance at the pirate. He simply walked, a slow, deliberate stride that seemed to absorb the very space around him. As he approached, the pirate, recognizing the terrifying power emanating from the silent figure, froze. He instinctively reached for the cutlass at his hip, but it was too late. Ren was upon him in an instant. It wasn't a strike of fury, or even of aggression. It was a precise, economical movement, a demonstration of lethal efficiency. His hand, moving with the uncanny speed of a predatory bird, intercepted the pirate's wrist, forcing the cutlass downwards and into the damp wood of the dock. The blade struck with a sickening thud, severing the tendons and sending the pirate collapsing to the ground. The fight was over before it had truly begun. The remaining pirates, witnessing their comrades' swift and brutal demise, retreated into the shadows, melting back into the swirling mist that clung to the coast. Ren knelt beside the fallen pirate, examining him briefly, not with judgment, but with a quiet, almost clinical observation. He gently closed the man's eyes, a final gesture of respect to a life extinguished by savagery. Then he carefully retrieved a small, tarnished silver pendant from the pirate's neck, a miniature dragon coiled around a skull. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers tracing the intricate detail, then, with a deliberate movement, tossed it into the churning waves. "Why did you do that?" Kai asked, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Ren raised his flute to his lips again, and the melody that emerged was different this time. It was a song of sorrow, of loss, and of acceptance. It acknowledged the darkness but offered no solace, only the unflinching reminder of its existence. "The sea claims all things," he finally said, his voice a low rumble, a whisper carried on the wind. "Even symbols of cruelty." He stood, his silhouette once more framed against the bruised dawn, the bokken held loosely at his side, the bamboo flute a silent extension of his soul. He looked out at the vast, indifferent ocean, a mirror reflecting the desolate landscape of his own heart. The echoes of the wooden blade, a silent, enduring testament to a warrior who chose to fight not with fire and steel, but with the quiet, terrifying power of silence. The horizon remained empty, the promise of a new day shrouded in mist, and the knowledge that, inevitably, more shadows would follow. Chapter 10. The serpent's coil, the salt-laced wind whipped at Ren's worn hakama as he moved along the jagged coastline. The rhythmic scrape of the bokken against the worn stone, a counterpoint to the ceaseless roar of the ocean. Mallow Bay was healing, visibly. The skeletal remains of the fortress were already being dismantled, salvaged timber slowly disappearing beneath the tireless hands of the villagers. The air, once thick with the stench of fear and burning oil, now carried the scent of wood smoke and, surprisingly, fish. Kai, recovered from his near-fatal encounter with a stray pirate blade, a consequence of Ren's impulsive intervention, shadowed him, his youthful energy a stark contrast to the Ronin's melancholic stillness. Kai, a former cartographer's apprentice, had become a reluctant but steadfast companion, driven by a curious blend of respect and a desperate need to understand the enigmatic warrior. "You haven't spoken a word in 3 days, Ren-san," Kai observed, his voice laced with a cautious concern. "The villagers, they whisper. They say you are a phantom, a spirit of the sea." Ren didn't respond, simply tilting his head slightly, a gesture that seemed to hold a myriad of unspoken thoughts. He continued his solitary pace, the bokken's handle worn smooth beneath his grip. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the slate-gray water, painting the waves with streaks of blood, orange, and violet, a morbid reflection of the carnage had witnessed. They stopped at a sheltered cove, a small crescent-shaped beach strewn with glistening pebbles. The air here held a different quality, heavy with the tang of seaweed and a subtle, earthy fragrance. It was here, amidst the debris of the battle, that Ren began to work. He was meticulously repairing a shattered fishing skiff, not with nails and planks, but with intricate weaving of kelp and tightly knotted rope. The villagers watched him with a quiet reverence, instinctively understanding that this wasn't simply a repair, it was an act of communion with the sea itself. Kai observed with a fascinated intensity, sketching the process in a small leather-bound journal. "You're creating something almost ritualistic," Kai said, breaking the silence. "Why the kelp?" "It's renowned for its razor sharpness." Ren finally paused, his dark eyes, devoid of pupils, fixed on the half-completed skiff. He raised his flute to his lips, and a slow, mournful melody spiraled into the air, a lament for the lost, a prayer for the future. The music wasn't a plea for mercy, but a focused channeling of intention, a whisper to the tides, a directive to the currents. "The sea remembers," Ren finally said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "It remembers the violence, the suffering. It needs to be reminded of its power, its capacity for both destruction and renewal." He then began to meticulously weave the kelp into a complex pattern, interlocking spirals and geometric designs that seemed to mimic the flow of the water. As he worked, Kai noticed something embedded within the kelp strands: small, iridescent scales. They shimmered with an unsettling beauty, the color of a bruised sunset. "What are these?" Kai asked, carefully examining the scales. Ren didn't answer, his movements precise and deliberate. As he continued weaving, the scales began to coalesce, forming a miniature serpent, intricately coiled around a shard of obsidian, the dragon pendant head retrieved from Red-Eye Garrow's neck. It wasn't a decorative piece, it was a carefully constructed trap, a miniature representation of the chaos head unleashed. "You built a mirror," Kai realized, understanding dawning in his eyes. A reflection of Garrow's own cruelty now returned to him. Ren ceased his work, his gaze distant. He slowly lifted the miniature serpent, turning it over in his hands, allowing the setting sun to catch the obsidian. The air grew thick with a palpable tension, a sense of impending closure. "The serpent never sleeps," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the crashing waves. "It waits for its moment. It coils tighter with every act of barbarity." He then raised the serpent to his lips, and with a single deliberate blow, crushed it against the stone. The obsidian shattered, scattering into 1,000 glittering fragments. The iridescent scales dissolved into the salty air, carried away by the wind. Silence descended once more, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the waves. Ren lowered his hand, his face impassive. "It is a lesson," he said, his voice devoid of judgment, simply stating a fact. A reminder that even the most cunning designs can be undone by the relentless forces of nature, and by the unwavering pursuit of justice. He looked out at the darkening ocean, a profound sadness etched into his stillness. The echoes of the wooden blade, silent and unwavering, continued to resonate, a testament to a warrior who had found his purpose not in the pursuit of glory, but in the quiet defiance of a world consumed by darkness. The horizon remained a bruised and impenetrable gray, promising only the continuation of the endless, silent dance between man and the sea. Chapter 11. The Tides Reflection. The rain had begun as a tentative drizzle, a gray veil clinging to the jagged cliffs of Mallow Bay. It intensified, a relentless, mournful curtain that mirrored the desolate landscape within Ren's soul. The aftermath of the burning flagship still smoldered, a bitter perfume of charcoal and salt hanging in the air. The villagers, soaked and shivering, worked with a desperate energy, hauling salvaged timber, patching damaged skiffs, and gathering the remnants of a victory hard won. Yet, a profound unease permeated the scene, a quiet acknowledgement of the price paid for their freedom. Ren remained on the edge of the ravaged docks, a solitary figure against the storm. He wasn't actively participating in the rebuilding, he was simply observing. He sat on a crate salvaged from the wreckage, the damp wood seeping into his worn hakama, the bokken resting across his lap like a silent, watchful sentinel. His flute lay nestled within its scabbard, untouched, a ghost of melodies past. Tonight, the sea felt different. Not the familiar, predictable beast had learned to respect, but something wounded, agitated. The waves crashed with a primal fury, not driven by the wind but by a deeper, darker current. It was as if the ocean itself was mourning. A grizzled fisherman, Taro, approached him, offering a rough-woven blanket. "Ren-san," he said, his voice hoarse, "you've seen enough. The healers say a man like you, lost in his silence, invites the spirits of the drowned." Ren simply nodded, accepting the blanket with a slow, deliberate movement. He didn't respond with words, but a single, prolonged note emerged from his flute. A low, sorrowful lament that seemed to soak directly into the rain. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Across the bay, a lone figure was rowing towards the burning remains of the flagship. It was Kai, one of the younger fishermen, a boy who had initially been terrified of Ren, but now regarded him with a cautious, almost reverent respect. Kai carried a small, intricately carved wooden box, identical to the one Ren had shattered earlier. As Kai drew closer, he began to chant, not words, but a series of rhythmic taps on the box, a sequence mirroring the sound of the serpent's death. The sound, sharp and unsettling, cut through the roar of the storm and the murmurs of the villagers. Ren's hand instinctively tightened around the bokken. The air around him thickened, heavy with a sensation he'd come to recognize the residue of a broken oath, a festering wound of betrayal. He rose silently, moving with the unsettling grace of a predator, his eyes fixed on Kai. "What are you doing?" Ren finally asked, his voice a low rumble, the first articulate sound he'd uttered in weeks. It wasn't a question seeking information, it was an observation, a judgment delivered with the weight of centuries. Kai didn't stop. He continued his rhythmic tapping, his face a mask of grim determination. "In preparing a reflection," he said, his voice strained against the wind, "Garrow sought to corrupt the sea with his brutality. He believed he could bend it to his will, just as he bent the lives of our people. We must show him that even darkness can be broken by reflection, by confronting its own ugliness." Ren understood. Kai, fueled by the rage of the villagers, had been attempting to recreate the destruction, to inflict a similar wound upon the symbol of Garrow's tyranny. But in doing so, he was merely delaying the inevitable, feeding the darkness, instead of extinguishing it. He moved swiftly, intercepting Kai before he could complete the ritual. He didn't strike him. Instead, he gently took the box from Kai's trembling hands. "You mistake the nature of shadows," Ren said, his voice laced with weary patience. "Garrow's cruelty was not a wound to be inflicted, but a reflection of his own soul. The serpent was a tool, a vessel for that reflection. Destroying it was not an act of justice, but a futile gesture." He examined the box, turning it over in his hands, a subtle movement laden with meaning. "The darkness doesn't vanish with a shattered image," he said, his gaze fixed on the turbulent sea. "It simply shifts, seeking a new surface to inhabit. The true battle is not against outward appearances, but against the internal tides of hatred and greed." With a deliberate, practiced motion, he crushed the box against the stone, echoing the destruction of the obsidian serpent. The rain intensified, washing away the remnants of the ritual, the lingering scent of incense and despair. "The tide," Ren said, his voice barely audible, "will cleanse everything. It always does." He lifted his flute to his lips and began to play. The melody was different now, not a lament, but a measured, resolute cadence, the echo of a warrior who had learned to navigate the darkest currents, a silent promise etched in the haunting music of the wooden blade. The horizon remained bruised and gray, but for the first time since Head arrived, Ren felt a flicker of something akin to hope, carried on the relentless breath of the sea. Chapter 12. The Salt of Regret. The rain hadn't truly ceased. It had become a persistent, mournful drizzle, clinging to the gray cliffs of Mallow Bay and mirroring the dampness that seemed to permeate Ren's very being. The scent of burnt timber and brine hung heavy in the air, a grim perfume of victory and loss. The villagers, exhausted but jubilant, were beginning to repair the damage, hauling splintered planks and hauling in the seaweed-strewn nets, their movements a tentative, grateful rhythm. Yet, Ren remained on the lower docks, a solitary figure sculpted from shadow and silence, his wooden blade, the bokken, a dark sentinel at his side. He wasn't celebrating. Celebration felt like a foreign, unsettling warmth, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. Instead, He was processing, meticulously, the brutal ballet of that night. The flickering flames of the flagship, the choked screams, the sickening splattering of blood, they were not images he could dismiss. They were etched onto the silent chambers of his mind, a permanent agonizing reminder of the violence he had unleashed. A young boy, no older than 10, approached him cautiously, carrying a small, intricately woven fishing net. "Master Ren-san," he stammered, offering the net with a nervous bow. "The villagers say you are a god. You saved us." Ren didn't respond. He simply observed the boy, his eyes dark and fathomless, taking in the earnest hope reflected in the child's face. He raised his flute, a worn piece of bamboo darkened with age and countless melodies, and began to play. The notes were slow, deliberate, a mournful counterpoint to the rough laughter of the fisherman. It wasn't a triumphant fanfare, but a somber requiem for the lives lost, for the innocent destroyed, for the corrupted ideals that had led him here. Old man Ito, a grizzled fisherman who'd been instrumental in the tactical changes, shuffled over, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by wind and sorrow. He didn't speak, but placed a calloused hand on Ren's arm, a silent gesture of gratitude. The touch was brief, almost hesitant, and Ren acknowledged it with a barely perceptible nod. It was in moments like these, in the quiet acknowledgement of shared hardship, that he felt the faintest tendrils of connection, fragile and fleeting as sea foam. Suddenly, a figure detached itself from the crowd. Captain Hashi, Garrow's second-in-command, a brute of a man with a shaved head and a permanent scowl. He approached Ren with a sneer, his hand resting on the pommel of a wicked-looking katana. "Well, well, well," Hoshi drawled, his voice thick with animosity. The silent monk finally shows his face. "You think you've won, little ghost. This is just the beginning." Ren remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the churning sea. He didn't rise to meet Hoshi's challenge. He didn't acknowledge the threat. He simply continued to play. The music became more insistent, more urgent. A dark warning carried on the wind. "You cling to the shadows, Hoshi," Ren finally said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of inflection. "Just as Garrow did. You believe violence is the answer. But violence only births more violence, a relentless cycle of suffering." Hoshi lunged, his katana flashing in the gray light. Ren sidestepped with a deceptive grace, his bokken a blur of wood as he deflected the blow. The clang of steel on wood echoed across the docks, a dissonant counterpoint to the haunting melody of his flute. It was a dance of death, a ballet of desperation, a demonstration of the lethal potential hidden within a simple wooden blade. This wasn't a desperate plea for honor, as some might assume. This wasn't a furious outburst of grief. This was something colder, more analytical. Ren wasn't seeking a confrontation, he was testing Hashi, assessing his resolve, probing the roots of his hatred. He parried, blocked, and countered with methodical precision, each movement economical, each strike aimed not at inflicting grievous injury, but at disrupting Hashi's rhythm, at exposing the vulnerability beneath the brute's facade. Finally, he disarmed Hoshi, sending the katana spinning into the wet planks. The pirate captain, breathing heavily, stared at Ren with a mixture of rage and bewilderment. "You're a shadow, monk," he spat. "A ghost. You won't change anything." Ren didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, he simply lowered his bokken and continued to play his flute. The melody shifted again, subtly, a minor variation on the theme, a lament, not for the fallen, but for the wasted potential, for the darkness that persisted, even in victory. As the last notes faded, Ren turned and walked away, leaving Hashi and the assembled villagers staring after him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The answer to Hoshi's question was already etched in the salt-stained air, in the ravaged landscape, in the enduring echo of the wooden blade's silent song. The battle had been won, but the war, the endless internal war against the shadows, was far from over. He was already moving toward the horizon, a solitary figure swallowed by the mist, a silent promise of a reckoning yet to come. Chapter 13. The Salt of Remembrance. The rain in Mallow Bay was a relentless, gray weeping. It clung to the slick, black stones of the docks, mirroring the film of despair that had settled over the village. The victory against Red-Eye Garrow had been brutal, swift, and utterly devoid of celebration. The villagers, exhausted and haunted, moved with a quiet solemnity, their faces etched with the knowledge of what they'd done and what they'd become. Ren, a silhouette against the perpetual drizzle, continued his solitary patrol. He hadn't spoken since the battle, his flute silent against his lips. The villagers, initially wary of the mute Ronin who'd single-handedly dismantled their tormentor, now regarded him with a mixture of reverence and apprehension. They understood instinctively that he wasn't celebrating their triumph. He was cataloging the cost. He found Hoshi brooding by the charred remains of the fishing vessel Kitsune, a knot of shame and fury twisting in his gut. The pirate captain, nursing a bleeding arm, was a grotesque parody of a man, his face swollen, his clothes torn, his eyes burning with a diminished rage. He hadn't attempted to flee, hadn't even bothered to curse Ren. He simply sat, a broken thing consumed by the bitter realization of his defeat. Ren approached slowly, the rhythmic tap of his bokken against the damp wood, the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. He stopped a respectful distance away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He began to play. Not a triumphant fanfare, but a slow, deliberate variation on the lament head played during the battle, a piece that seemed to weave itself from the mournful cries of the seabirds and the relentless wash of the waves. It wasn't a melody of victory, but a profound acknowledgement of loss. Hoshi watched him, his expression unreadable. "You mock me, monk," he finally rasped, his voice thick with phlegm and pain. "You drown the sound of my rage in your silence." Ren didn't turn. The flute continued its mournful procession. "Silence," he offered finally, his voice a low, gravelly murmur, "is the language of the sea. It speaks of time, of erosion, of the inevitable return to the void." He paused, the notes hanging suspended in the air like fragile blossoms. "You fought with fury, Captain. A storm of wasted energy. It consumed you." He slowly raised his bokken, not in a threat, but as a gesture of understanding, of shared experience. Fury leaves scars deeper than any blade. Hoshi lunged, fueled by the simmering embers of his rage. His katana, dulled by the seawater and battle, felt clumsy in his hand. Ren moved with an unsettling grace, a phantom adapting to Hoshi's every thrust, intercepting with precise economical movements. He didn't seek to wound, merely to deflect, to disrupt. He wasn't engaging in a duel, he was performing a ritual, a quiet examination of the destructive impulse. The rain intensified, blurring the line between the sea and the sky. The air crackled with the unspoken tension. Ren's movements were hypnotic, each parry, block, and counter a deliberate meditation. He was stripping away Hoshi's aggression, revealing the raw, vulnerable core beneath. Finally, after a prolonged exchange, Ren disarmed Hoshi again, the katana spinning through the air before clattering onto the wet planks. He didn't raise his bokken to strike. He simply held it aloft, a dark, silent symbol. "Why?" Hoshi choked out, his voice laced with disbelief. "Why do you do this? Why do you play this dirge?" Ren lowered his bokken, his gaze meeting Hoshi's briefly, a brief, unsettling flash of something dark and ancient within his eyes. "I observe," he said, his voice a whisper carried on the wind. "I don't judge. I don't offer solutions. I merely listen." He turned away, resuming his slow, measured walk towards the broken remnants of Kitsune. He deliberately avoided meeting Hoshi's gaze. As he passed, Hoshi shouted, "You think you're some kind of spirit? Some arbiter of souls? You are nothing." You are a ghost." Ren didn't respond. He continued his way along the docks, the rain washing the salt from his clothes, blurring the lines of his face. He stopped beside a young boy, no older than 8, who was meticulously stacking salvaged driftwood. The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide with a hesitant curiosity. Ren offered him a small, smooth stone head found amongst the debris, a piece of polished gray, shaped by the relentless force of the waves. It was a gift, a gesture of unexpected kindness. The boy accepted it with a shy smile. As Ren walked on, he glanced back at Hoshi, who was still slumped beside the wrecked vessel, staring at the stone. The captain's face was etched with a profound sadness, a realization, perhaps, that his rage, his hatred, was no match for the enduring silence of the wooden blade. The rain continued to fall, washing away the traces of the battle, carrying with it the salty breath of remembrance. Ren continued to walk toward the horizon, a solitary figure swallowed by the mist, his flute's silent song a constant haunting echo in the heart of Mallow Bay. The war, he knew, was not won. It simply shifted, like the tides, its currents forever shaped by the echoes of the wooden blade. Chapter 14. The Tide of Sorrow. The rain hadn't ceased, not entirely. It had shifted, become a persistent drizzle, clinging to the gray slate of Mallow Bay and chilling Ren to the bone. Had spent the day with the villagers, a silent observer amidst their tentative joy, a hesitant rebuilding of their shattered lives. The boy, whose name was Kenji, now clutched the stone tightly, a small, smooth talisman against the lingering darkness. Ren had watched him, a flicker of something akin to understanding in his dark eyes, as Kenji meticulously arranged the driftwood, building a miniature harbor, a fragile mirror of the one that had been stolen. He continued his walk, the rhythmic creak of the docks beneath his worn sandals, a counterpoint to the persistent drumming of the rain. He wasn't searching for anything, not actively. He simply moved, a ghost through a landscape still scarred by violence, a silent sentinel guarding the memory of a broken oath. He knew Hoshi hadn't moved, hadn't spoken since the last, desperate moments of the battle. The captain's posture was slumped, a broken marionette, his gaze fixed on the stone Kenji had offered. The air itself felt heavy with sorrow, a tangible presence layered beneath the dampness. He thought of the fisherman, the old man who'd spent a lifetime wrestling the sea's bounty, reduced to a bargaining chip in Garrow's brutal game. He thought of the girl, her desperate plea for mercy, a poignant testament to the inherent injustice that had poisoned Mallow Bay. Suddenly, a movement. A figure emerged from the gloom of a collapsed warehouse, a woman, her face smeared with mud and exhaustion, clutching a small battered lantern. It was Hana, the daughter of the fisherman, her eyes red-rimmed, her movements hesitant. "Ronin-san," she said, her voice raw, barely audible above the rain. "Thank you. Truly. You saved my father." Ren inclined his head, a slight movement of acknowledgement. He offered her a silent nod, a brief acknowledgement of shared grief and unspoken gratitude. "The nets," she continued, gesturing towards the docks. "We've begun to repair them, using kelp as you taught us. It's difficult. The texture, the sharpness, he didn't speak, but she understood. He wasn't offering advice, wasn't instructing. He was simply present, his presence a grounding force in her swirling emotions. As she spoke, a subtle shift in the air caught his attention. The rain had lessened, revealing a break in the clouds, a sliver of bruised purple sky. And then he heard it, a faint, mournful note drifting on the wind. His flute. He hadn't played in weeks, not since Mallow Bay. The urge had been a primal tremor, a need to express the sorrow he felt so deeply, the weight of lives lost, of choices made. But he resisted, deliberately silencing the instrument. The music, he realized, wasn't a solution. It was a vulnerability, an offering of pain that he couldn't afford. But now, the flute was playing again, a slow, haunting melody, a lament for the drowned. He followed the sound, his boots splashing through the puddles, and found Hoshi, sitting motionless on the edge of the harbor, the stone still held in his hand. The captain's face was devoid of expression, his eyes reflecting the gray light, but the flute seemed to penetrate the shell of his rage, to touch the core of his despair. Ren knelt beside him, his movements deliberate, silent. He didn't touch him, didn't speak. He simply remained there, a silent presence beside the broken captain. The flute continued its mournful song, a plea for release, for understanding. As the last note faded, Hoshi finally moved, his hand reaching out to the stone. He turned it over in his palm, examining its smooth surface, as if seeking answers within its shape. "Use silence," he rasped, his voice hoarse from disuse and grief. "You stripped the world of its cries. But the sea never forgets." He looked out at the shimmering surface of the bay, the waves reflecting the bruised sky. "The tides, Ronin-san," he said, a strange flicker of something akin to regret in his eyes. "They will always return to claim what was lost, like echoes like the wooden blade." Ren nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. The battle wasn't over. It had merely shifted, like the tides, its currents forever shaped by the echoes of the wooden blade. And he, the silent Ronin, would remain. A solitary figure, a guardian of sorrow, until the echoes finally faded into the endless gray. Chapter 15. Salt and Ash. The salt spray clung to Ren's face, cold and persistent, mirroring the chill that had settled in his bones. Mallow Bay was a ghost of its former self. The fortress, a brutal testament to Garrow's greed, pulsed with flickering torchlight, a malignant heartbeat against the bruised dusk. The air reeked of burnt timber and the metallic tang of blood, a scent that clung to his clothes, to his very skin. He hadn't slept since the night of the assault. The sounds, the screams of the villagers, the clang of steel, the roar of the flames had burrowed into his consciousness, a relentless, looping nightmare. Had found Hoshi huddled by the shattered remains of the church, the stone still clutched in his hand, a chilling reminder of the captain's final, broken rage. Hoshi's words, "The sea never forgets," echoed in Ren's mind, heavy with a tragic inevitability. He moved with a practiced, almost spectral grace, navigating the debris-strewn docks. Fishermen, faces itched with exhaustion and grief, tended to the injured, their movements slow and deliberate, mirroring his own. They offered him water, a meager broth. But their eyes held a profound, unspoken sadness, a sadness he couldn't reflect, couldn't even fully comprehend. He was a vessel for their sorrow, a silent sentinel against a tide of despair. Had spent the last hours reinforcing the modified skiffs, the kelp nets woven with a grim efficiency. The fishermen, energized by a flickering hope, worked with a ferocious dedication, their movements honed by years of battling the ocean's capricious moods. They were not warriors, not in the traditional sense. They were survivors, bound together by a shared trauma and a desperate desire to reclaim their home. Suddenly, a young boy, no older than 12, burst from the shadows, his face streaked with soot and his eyes wide with frantic urgency. "Ronin-san!" "They're preparing to burn the grain stores," he shouted, his voice raw with fear. "They say the captain wants to starve them into submission." Ren didn't respond verbally. He simply nodded, a subtle inclination of his head, and began to move. His bokken held loosely at his side, a silent promise of protection. The movement wasn't born of aggression, but of purpose, a carefully calculated course correcting amidst a storm of chaos. He reached the storage sheds, hastily constructed from salvaged timber, and thatched with seaweed, just as the pirates, led by a hulking brute wielding a spiked mace, were setting the roof ablaze. The flames licked at the dry wood, casting grotesque shadows that danced with the panicked faces of the villagers. Ren didn't charge. Instead, he utilized the limited space, utilizing a shift in the tides as Head taught the fisherman. He moved with a bewildering swiftness, appearing and disappearing in the periphery of the pirates' vision, disrupting their attacks, sowing confusion. His bokken, despite its wood, moved with deadly precision, deflecting blows, shattering the mace's spiked head, momentarily stunning the brute. The pirates, accustomed to overwhelming force, were thrown off balance by Ren's silent, unpredictable attacks. They swung wildly, their movements clumsy and frustrated, while Ren, a ghost in the inferno, continued to harass them, a relentless, suffocating presence. He wasn't fighting for glory, for vengeance, or even for the villagers. He was fighting for the echo of what had been lost, for the memory of the thriving village, for the potential of a future free from oppression. He fought for the silent, heartbreaking truth that he alone could carry. As he disarmed the brute, sending him sprawling into the burning grain, Garrow himself appeared, his face contorted with fury, his black powder pistol leveled at Ren's head. The air crackled with the smell of sulfur. Ren remained motionless, a statue of defiance against the backdrop of the raging flames. He didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to acknowledge the threat. Garrow fired. The shot echoed through the bay, and a ball of fire burst from the pistol barrel, narrowly missing Ren's head. Then, with a guttural roar, Garrow charged, his axe raised high, preparing to deliver a killing blow. But Ren, anticipating the attack, shifted his weight, stepping aside with an almost impossible grace. Garrow's axe whistled past, missing him by inches, and slammed into a supporting beam, sending splinters of wood flying. And in that moment, Ren reacted. His bokken, a blur of motion, intercepted Garrow's arm, a precise, decisive strike that dislocated the captain's shoulder. Garrow bellowed in pain, clutching at his injured limb, and stumbled backward, falling into the flames. The pirates, witnessing their leader's sudden downfall, hesitated. The tide of the battle had subtly shifted, influenced by the relentless, almost unnerving calm of the silent Ronin. As the first fireboat roared toward the burning flagship, propelled by the fisherman's cunning and Ren's silent command, Ren continued to move, a solitary figure amidst the chaos, an embodiment of sorrow and defiance, a silent promise etched in the salt-laced air.